Uh, stage one here is referring to stage 1 of 2. First stage being beginner, second stage being intermediate, where we read a text of Greek. Lesson 1 begins with an introduction to the Greek language. Alexander brought Greek to the known world, as we would call it in the classical terms, and out as far as Bactria, south as far as Egypt, and the Roman elite also learned Greek as far west as Rome. Probably a bit before that, the Koine or the Kini Attic dialect was used as a common way of discussing things together, both in Athens and further afield, where Athens had economic influence. And so it's not the literary form, it's the more colloquial form of the language, and this is the one that the New Testament was written in and that Alexander spread. So it's an evolution and development of the Attic dialect. So 1.13 talks about Jesus giving his instructions and teaching in Greek, but it may be a translation from Aramaic. So at times it's worth looking at the Hebrew or the Aramaic behind the Greek, what we call a Vorlage, or the text that something is translated from. But it was the lingua franca, the language of communication. Section 1.14 talks about the alphabet. The alphabet used to have perhaps 27 characters, but in Athens, in 403 BC, before Alexander's time, 100 years before Alexander, or 70 years before Alexander, we have a law passed that took out the digamma, and this book heavily looks at how the sounds have changed before the spelling reforms that will become clear in time. Section 1.15 talks about uncial writing, meaning that everything was written in capital letters at the time that the Gospels were composed, or that the tradition was written down. The stories of the Gospels were actually put in writing. Greek was using uncial, and it was also using scripta continua, which means there were no spaces between the words. It's not very relevant, but it can be. Then 1.16 says that in our text that we read now, the minuscule texts, little letter texts, the capital letters are used for proper names to mark the beginning of paragraphs and beginning of direct speech. In section 1.17 and 1.18, 1.19, he introduces the system, the background for the system of pronunciation, and he introduces the system of pronunciation. There are 3 basic systems of pronunciation. One is the Erasmian system, where you make Greek sound like English or German if you're from there, or American if you're from America, and it's the least difficulty in reading. You make things sound like your own language. The second one is to pronounce like modern Greek, and the third one is to pronounce in restored Koine, which is a bit like dressing up in period clothing. I'll be using the restored Koine, which is basically modern Greek spoken by an alvaniotis, using the U for upsilon and omicron iota, like in the Phanariot and Old Attic dialects, as there were